The radar operator stares at his screen at 1100 hours on February 12, 1942. Flight Lieutenant Gerald Kidd has been tracking what he believes is a German convoy moving northeast through the English Channel. But the size of the formation keeps growing. What began as a few escort vessels has expanded to dozens of contacts. The speed is wrong too. Merchant convoys do not travel at 28 knots. Kidd reaches for the telephone to report to headquarters when the reality crystallizes. This is not a convoy. This is the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, and their escorts breaking out of Brest and racing through the Channel toward Germany in broad daylight. By the time British forces react, the Germans will be past the narrowest point of the Dover Strait, protected by fighters from shore bases, and untouchable by the aging aircraft and scattered naval forces. Britain can scramble in response in 12 hours. The German fleet will reach German waters having sailed 240 miles through the channel that Britain claimed to control, humiliating the Royal Navy, exposing the limitations of British air power, and demonstrating that German operational planning could achieve what British overconfidence assumed impossible. The German ships had been trapped in Brest since March 1941. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, sister battlecruisers, represented significant German naval power. Displacement: 38,900 tons fully loaded. Armament: 9 11-inch guns and 3 triple turrets. 12 5.9-inch secondary guns. Numerous anti-aircraft weapons. Maximum speed: 32 knots. Armor: 14-inch belt, 4-inch deck. These were not battleships with 15 or 16-inch guns, but they were fast, well-armored, and capable of destroying any cruiser and outrunning any battleship. Prinz Eugen, an Admiral Hipper-class heavy cruiser, displaced 18,400 tons, mounted 8 8-inch guns, and could make 32 knots. She had accompanied Bismarck on that battleship's fatal sortie in May 1941, escaped when Bismarck was sunk, and made it to Brest under constant air attack. The 3 ships, supported by destroyers and smaller vessels, constituted a fleet in being, tying down British naval resources by their mere presence. RAF Bomber Command attacked them repeatedly in port. Over 300 raids had been flown against Brest between April 1941 and February 1942. Bombs had damaged all 3 capital ships multiple times, but the Germans repaired them, moved them between docks to avoid repeat attacks, and surrounded them with anti-aircraft defenses that made the port one of the most heavily defended targets in occupied Europe. By early 1942, Hitler wanted the ships back in Germany. His reasoning was partly defensive. Partly offensive, the defensive concern was continued British bombing. Each raid risked catastrophic damage. The ships were essentially static targets, valuable but vulnerable. The offensive reasoning involved Norway. Hitler believed the British would invade Norway to threaten Germany's northern flank and disrupt iron ore shipments from Sweden. Having heavy ships in Norway would deter invasion or contest it if attempted. The route from Brest to Germany offered 2 options. The northern route, out into the Atlantic, around Scotland, through the North Sea to German ports. This was the conventional route, safer from shore-based aircraft but longer, exposing the fleet to British home fleet heavy units operating from Scapa Flow. The alternative? East through the English Channel, the narrow waters between England and France, waters the British considered their domain. Vice Admiral Otto Celiax commanded the squadron. He received his orders in January. Prepare to transit the Channel at highest speed with maximum fighter cover. The operation was designated Cerberus, named for the mythological 3-headed dog guarding the underworld. The symbolism was apt, 3 capital ships breaking out of confinement through a passage considered impassable. German planning was meticulous. Success required surprise, speed, and overwhelming fighter protection. The ships would depart Brest after dark, transit the Channel during daylight when fighters could provide cover, and reach the narrowest point at Dover around noon when British reconnaissance was typically least active. The Luftwaffe committed 300 fighters to provide continuous air cover. Minesweepers would clear the route ahead of the fleet. E-boats, German motor torpedo boats, would screen the flanks. The plan required precision timing and acceptance of risk. If discovered too early, the fleet would face coordinated attack from air and sea forces while confined to narrow waters. British intelligence knew the Germans might attempt a breakout. Ultra-intercepts revealed increased activity at Brest. Reconnaissance flights noted the ships had completed repairs, but British planners assumed any breakout would use the northern route. The channel route was too risky, too exposed. The prevailing British assessment was that the Germans, while aggressive, were not suicidal. This assessment shaped British dispositions. The home fleet remained at Scapa Flow, positioned to intercept a northern breakout. Coastal Command maintained reconnaissance patrols over the western approaches, but with gaps in coverage. The Dover Strait was observed by radar and patrol aircraft, but the assumption was that any German movement would be detected with sufficient warning to organize proper response. The German fleet departed Brest at 22:45 hours on February 11th. Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Prinz Eugen, 6 destroyers, and numerous smaller escorts. They moved in darkness, maintaining radio silence, navigating channels cleared through British minefields by minesweepers that had worked for weeks preparing the route. German intelligence had identified gaps in British radar coverage and patrol patterns. The fleet exploited these gaps. British detection failed across multiple systems. Coastal Command aircraft that should have spotted the fleet encountered equipment failures. One patrol aircraft's radar malfunctioned. Another was recalled early due to weather. A submarine stationed off Brest to watch for breakout attempts was on the surface charging batteries when the German fleet passed in darkness. The submarine's lookout saw nothing. By dawn on February 12th, the German fleet was 60 miles east of Brest, steaming at 27 knots through light fog. 300 Luftwaffe fighters, operating in relays from French airfields, provided continuous cover. The fighters formed a protective umbrella that made visual or radar detection difficult and would engage any British aircraft attempting reconnaissance or attack. At 10:00 hours, the fleet was off Cherbourg, still undetected. At 10:20 hours, 2 RAF Spitfires on routine patrol spotted the formation, but their radios malfunctioned. They returned to base to report, landing at 1100 hours. By then, the Germans were off Le Havre. Flight Lieutenant Kidd's radar contact at 1100 hours was the first confirmed detection, but confirming detection and organizing response were different problems. The information had to go up chain of command, be analyzed, trigger alert systems, and mobilize forces. British command structure was fragmented. Coastal Command, Bomber Command, Fighter Command, and the Admiralty all had responsibilities for channel defense, but coordination was poor. The Admiralty ordered torpedo boat attacks, 6 motor torpedo boats, small fast vessels armed with 2 or 4 torpedoes each, departed Dover at 1130 hours. They ran into the German formation at 1230 hours. The MTBs, each displacing 70 to 80 tons, attacked capital ships displacing 38,000 tons while under fire from destroyers, E-boats, and strafing fighters. Every torpedo missed. 1 MTB was sunk. The rest retreated under smoke. Bomber Command scrambled available aircraft, but most bomber squadrons were at dispersed bases preparing for night operations against Germany. Getting them armed, briefed, and airborne took hours. The first bombers, 15 Hamptons from Bomber Command, attacked at 1400 hours. They faced intense anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition. None scored hits. 1 bomber was shot down. Fighter Command sent 6 Swordfish torpedo bombers with Spitfire escort. The Swordfish, obsolete biplanes with fabric covering and a maximum speed of 138 miles per hour, had sunk Bismarck in 1941. But Bismarck had been alone in the Atlantic, already damaged, and facing attack from multiple directions. The German fleet in the Channel was undamaged, moving at high speed, and protected by fighters. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Ismond led the Swordfish attack from HMS Campania. He commanded 825 Naval Air Squadron. Veterans of multiple operations. They knew the mission was nearly suicidal, but went anyway. 6 Swordfish, each carrying 1 18-inch torpedo with a 700-pound warhead. The Spitfire escort, 10 fighters from 609th Squadron, would suppress flak and engage German fighters. The attack began at 1235 hours off the Belgian coast. The Swordfish descended to wave-top altitude to arm their torpedoes and begin attack runs. German fighters dove on them immediately. The Spitfires tried to intercept but were outnumbered and could not prevent all attacks. German Focke-Wulf, FW-190, and Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters tore into the slow-moving biplanes. The first Swordfish was shot down before releasing its torpedo. The second released, missed, and was shot down seconds later. Esmond's aircraft was hit multiple times, caught fire, but continued toward Scharnhorst. Esmond released his torpedo at 600 yards, close enough to see sailors on the battlecruiser's deck. The torpedo ran true, but Scharnhorst turned hard. The torpedo passed astern, and Esmond's burning aircraft crashed into the sea. All 6 swordfish were shot down. 13 aircrew died. 5 survived. Picked up by British rescue launches. Not one torpedo hit. Esmond received a posthumous Victoria Cross. His courage was unquestionable. The futility of the attack was equally clear. Destroyer attacks came next. The Royal Navy had positioned destroyers at Harwich specifically to intercept any German channel movement. Captain Mark Pisey commanded 5 destroyers: HMS Campbell, HMS Vivacious, HMS Worcester, HMS Mackay, and HMS Whitshed. They departed Harwich at 1200 hours, heading southwest to intercept. They met the German fleet at 1530 hours off the Dutch coast. 5 destroyers. Total displacement 7,000 tons. Attacking 2 battlecruisers, displacing 77,000 tons combined. Plus a heavy cruiser and escort vessels, all under air cover. The destroyers tried to close to torpedo range. German destroyers screened the capital ships. A running gun battle developed. Campbell was hit and damaged. Mackay took damage. No British torpedoes reached the capital ships. The destroyers withdrew. By 1600 hours, the German fleet was past the narrowest point of the channel and entering Dutch waters. British attacks had failed across every domain: motor torpedo boats, bombers, torpedo bombers, destroyers, all repulsed without inflicting damage. The Germans had sailed through the channel in daylight, engaged multiple British forces, and emerged unscathed. But the operation was not complete. The fleet still had to navigate the mine-dense waters off the Netherlands and reach German ports. At 1930 hours, Scharnhorst struck a mine off the Dutch coast. The explosion damaged her starboard propulsion. She slowed to 12 knots. Repairs took 90 minutes. At 2155 hours, she struck a second mine. More damage, more delays. Gneisenau struck a mine at 2000 hours, but damage was minor. Prinz Eugen avoided the mines entirely and reached Wilhelmshaven on February 13th. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau made it to German ports despite mine damage. All 3 ships had survived the Channel Dash. British forces had been humiliated. The British press reaction was savage. The Times called it the most mortifying episode in British naval history since the Dutch burned our ships in the Medway in 1667. Parliament demanded explanations. Churchill faced questions about how German battleships could sail through the English Channel undetected and unscathed. The Admiralty ordered inquiries. Recriminations began immediately. The fundamental problem was coordination failure. Multiple organizations had responsibility for channel defense, but no unified command. Coastal Command flew reconnaissance, but reported through its own chain. Fighter Command provided fighters, but operated independently. The Admiralty controlled naval forces, but had poor communication with air forces. When the crisis developed, each organization responded according to its own procedures with minimal coordination. Intelligence had failed. Ultra had provided warnings, but they were not acted upon effectively. Reconnaissance gaps were known but not addressed. The assumption that Germans would not risk the Channel route proved fatally wrong. British planning suffered from overconfidence. The belief that British control of the Channel was absolute and that any German attempt would be detected early and defeated easily. The forces available for Channel defense were inadequate. The motor torpedo boats were too small and too few. The swordfish were obsolete. The bomber squadrons were dispersed and not on alert status. The destroyers were outnumbered. If German battleships were going to transit the Channel, defeating them required heavy ships, submarines positioned along their route, and coordinated airstrikes with sufficient numbers to overwhelm defenses. Britain had none of this in place. German planning exploited every British weakness. The nighttime departure from Brest, the timing to pass Dover at midday, the overwhelming fighter cover, the mine-cleared channels, the acceptance of risk in exchange for surprise, all demonstrated operational competence. The Germans had assessed British capabilities realistically and planned to avoid British strengths while exploiting gaps. The strategic consequences were limited. The 3 ships reached Germany but were not immediately operational. Mine damage required repairs. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau spent months in docks. Gneisenau was damaged by RAF bombing while under repair and never returned to operational status. Scharnhorst eventually deployed to Norway, where she was sunk by HMS Duke of York in December 1943. Prinz Eugen survived the war but accomplished little after the Channel Dash. But the tactical and psychological impact was severe. The Royal Navy, which had dominated the Channel for centuries, had been unable to prevent German ships from transiting in daylight. British air power, supposedly the answer to naval threats, had proven unable to stop capital ships with fighter cover. The German Kriegsmarine, written off after Bismarck's loss and the failure to invade Britain, had demonstrated it could still execute complex operations successfully. For the British public, already enduring defeats in North Africa and Asia, the Channel Dash was another humiliation. Singapore would fall 3 days later on February 15th. The string of disasters seemed endless. Churchill's government faced serious pressure. The confidence that Britain could win the war, strong in 1940, was wavering in early 1942. The operational lessons were clear but took time to implement. Channel defenses needed unified command. Reconnaissance had to be continuous with no gaps. Attack forces had to be on alert status, ready to respond within minutes, not hours. Coordination between services required better communications and clearer procedures. These lessons would be applied to D-Day planning, where preventing German naval interference with invasion forces required meticulous preparation. The German perspective on Cerberus was satisfaction mixed with awareness of costs. They had achieved a tactical victory but lost strategic flexibility. The ships in Brest threatened British Atlantic convoys and tied down substantial British naval resources watching them. Once in Germany, they were less threatening. They could raid into the Arctic, but could not reach the Atlantic without running a gauntlet of British forces. Hitler's obsession with Norway meant the ships would be committed to northern waters where opportunities for decisive action were limited. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, privately criticized the operation. He believed the battleships were wasted assets that should have been scrapped with their steel and guns repurposed for U-boat construction. Surface raiders could not win the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats could. Every resource diverted to maintaining capital ships was lost to submarine warfare. But Hitler and the Naval High Command valued the symbolic and deterrent effect of battleships. Scharnhorst in Norwegian waters represented a threat to Arctic convoys, forced Britain to maintain heavy covering forces, and supported Hitler's conviction that Norway was vulnerable to invasion. That these benefits were marginal compared to the resources consumed did not matter. The decision was political as much as military. The Channel Dash also demonstrated Luftwaffe effectiveness in its proper role. German fighters providing air cover over the fleet had prevented any effective British air attack. The Luftwaffe had failed in the Battle of Britain trying to achieve air superiority over England, but it succeeded in Operation Cerberus providing localized air superiority over a moving naval force. The lesson was clear. Air power used properly and in concentration could dominate. Air power dispersed or sent against targets beyond its capability would fail. The fate of the Swordfish crews became symbolic of the entire operation. Their courage attacking against overwhelming odds, their losses, and the futility of their sacrifice encapsulated British frustration. They had done everything asked, attacked with determination, and accomplished nothing because they were given an impossible mission with inadequate support. Eugene Esmond's posthumous Victoria Cross was deserved, but could not obscure the institutional failure that sent obsolete aircraft against modern capital ships with insufficient support. The award honored individual courage, while implicitly acknowledging systemic incompetence. Esmond and his crews deserved better than a suicide mission. British command owed them forces adequate to their mission. The gap between what was provided and what was needed was measured in dead aircrew. The motor torpedo boat crews received less attention, but their experience was similar. Sent against battleships with destroyers screening, they had no realistic chance of success. They attacked anyway, lost one boat, and achieved nothing. Their courage was real. The planning that put them in that situation was negligent. The destroyer captains faced the same calculus. 5 destroyers against a fleet including 2 battlecruisers was not a battle. It was a massacre waiting to happen. That they escaped with only damage rather than losses was luck more than planning. Ordering them to attack demonstrated either desperation or disregard for their survival. Throughout the operation, individual British units performed with courage and determination. They followed orders, attacked when told to attack, and fought against impossible odds. The failure was not at unit level, but at operational and strategic levels. The forces were inadequate. The coordination was absent. The planning was optimistic. The execution was improvised. That individual acts of courage could not compensate for these failures was predictable. Post-war analyses examined why British performance was so poor. Some blamed rigid command structures that prevented flexible response. Others pointed to inter-service rivalry that prevented effective coordination. Still others emphasized the shock of reverses in 1941 and early 1942 that had damaged institutional confidence. All these factors contributed, but the fundamental issue was simpler. The British had assumed their control of the Channel was absolute and had not prepared for a determined German challenge. The assumption of superiority, not backed by adequate forces or preparation, led to disaster. When the Germans called the bluff by sailing their fleet through the Channel, British forces could not respond effectively because they had never seriously prepared to do so. The motor torpedo boats, the obsolete torpedo bombers, the dispersed bomber squadrons, the inadequate destroyer force, all reflected an institutional assumption that the Germans would never try something so audacious. But audacity was often the best strategy for the weaker force. The Germans understood they could not win a set-piece battle in the Channel, but they also understood that British forces were not concentrated or coordinated to prevent a rapid transit. The window of vulnerability existed. Exploiting it required precise timing, overwhelming local superiority in fighters, and willingness to accept casualties from mines and potential attacks. The Germans accepted these terms and succeeded. At 1100 hours on February 12, 1942, Flight Lieutenant Gerald Kidd stared at his radar screen, showing a German fleet steaming through waters Britain claimed to control. He reported what he saw. The information went up the chain. Forces responded, but every response was too little, too late, too uncoordinated to prevent the Germans from achieving their objective. Kidd's detection was timely. The failure was everything that came after. British forces needed hours to organize responses that needed to happen in minutes. By the time attacks developed, the Germans were past the critical choke points. Their fighters had established air superiority over the fleet, and British attacks were piecemeal instead of concentrated. The Channel Dash succeeded because German planning was superior to British preparation. The Germans had assessed their capabilities realistically, identified British weaknesses accurately, and executed a plan that exploited those weaknesses. The British had assumed superiority without ensuring they had the forces or coordination to back that assumption. When tested, the assumption proved hollow. Operation Cerberus stands as a case study in how operational competence can overcome strategic weakness. The Germans were losing the war in February 1942. They could not win in the long term, but in the narrow confines of the Channel Dash, they achieved complete tactical success through better planning, better execution, and better understanding of their opponent's limitations. The humiliation was Britain's. The lesson was universal. Assumptions of superiority must be validated by preparation and capability. Control is not claimed, it is exercised, and audacity, properly executed, can achieve what conventional wisdom declares impossible. The German fleet sailed through the Channel in daylight because they planned to do exactly that, and the British failed to prepare for exactly that. The gap between what Britain claimed to control and what it could actually defend was exposed for the world to see, measured in German ships steaming untouched through waters that were supposed to be impassable.